It is the early hours of October 23rd, 1942, and the western desert of Egypt is doing something it almost never does. It is waiting. 40 miles southwest of a railway halt called El Alamein, a German reconnaissance officer is crouched in a forward observation post, watching the horizon through field glasses that have grown hot in his hands despite the chill of the desert night. Somewhere out there, beyond the wire and the silence, he believes an entire British armored division is forming up, ready to strike along the southern flank of the line. He has seen the tanks. His aircraft have photographed them, dispersed in their hundreds across the sand, exactly where good tradecraft would put a force preparing for a southern push. He has reported this in detail to Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's headquarters. He is entirely correct about what he has seen. He is entirely wrong about what it means, because the tanks he has spent weeks watching are not tanks at all. They are plywood and canvas, stretched over wooden frames, weighing perhaps as much as a heavy wardrobe, and not one of them could fire a shot or crush a blade of grass beneath a tread that does not exist. 18 miles to the north, in the real assembly areas, several hundred genuine Sherman and Grant tanks sit disguised as 3-ton lorries, hidden beneath canvas hoods that British camouflage officers have nicknamed sun shields. A German pilot flying directly overhead that morning would see what appears to be a vast and unremarkable supply convoy. He would not see an armored fist about to be driven through the center of the Axis line. This is the work of a deception so methodical, so patiently built over weeks, that it would eventually persuade Rommel's own deputy that the 8th Army possessed an entire extra armored division it did not have, and that the coming attack would fall somewhere it had no intention of falling, on a date that was already wrong by the time he made his calculation. What you are about to hear is the story of how a British camouflage unit, built largely from artists, set designers and stage magicians rather than soldiers, learned to lie to an army with sand, wood, and old packing cases, and in doing so helped turn the Second Battle of El Alamein from a desperate gamble into one of the most complete tactical surprises achieved by either side in the entire war. It is a story with very little glamour in the conventional sense. There are no commandos scaling cliffs, no daring escapes. Instead, there is something stranger and in some ways more remarkable: the spectacle of professional soldiers spending months building an army that did not exist, with the sole purpose of making a German general believe his own eyes. The desert war that had ground on since 1940 was, by the autumn of 1942, a contest with almost no secrets left in it. This was the essential problem facing British planners, and it very nearly made the entire operation impossible. The western desert offered no forest to hide an army in, no hills to mask a flank, no weather worth speaking of beyond heat, dust, and the occasional sandstorm. The front line between the Mediterranean coast and the impassable salt marsh of the Qattara Depression stretched for barely 30 miles, a corridor so narrow and so flat that German aerial reconnaissance could photograph nearly every vehicle on the British side within a day of it arriving. Any large formation moving into position could expect to be spotted, identified, and reported within hours. Rommel's intelligence staff were experienced, methodical, and had spent 2 years learning to read the patterns of British build-ups with real skill. General Bernard Montgomery, who had taken command of the 8th Army in August, needed to move roughly 1,000 tanks, 900 field guns, and the better part of 3 infantry divisions into position for an offensive, without the enemy noticing where the blow would actually fall or when it would land. The arithmetic of the problem was brutal. Montgomery's planners calculated that simply moving the armor of X Corps from its dispersed holding areas to its forward attack positions would take roughly 2 nights of vehicle movement, an amount of dust and noise that no amount of midnight scheduling could fully disguise from an enemy who had aircraft in the air at first light. Worse, the British needed Rommel to believe 2 specific falsehoods at once. First, that the main weight of the attack would fall in the south rather than the north, and second, that it would not begin for at least another fortnight. Either deception alone might have been achievable. Both together, in a landscape with nowhere to hide, looked close to impossible. There was a further difficulty, more psychological than physical. The Eighth Army had been deceived by German camouflage and feints more than once in the preceding 18 months, and Rommel had built a fearsome reputation for divining British intentions before the British had settled on them themselves. Many of Montgomery's own staff doubted that a deception on this scale, conducted in full view of enemy reconnaissance with no natural cover whatsoever, could possibly hold up under scrutiny for the 6 weeks it would need to. The existing toolkit of desert camouflage, mostly nets and paint applied piecemeal by individual units, had never been asked to disguise an entire army's order of battle in real time against a professional and suspicious opponent. Something far more ambitious would be required, and it would need to be built almost from nothing, by men who had no formal training in deceiving armies at all. The man given responsibility for solving this problem was Colonel Dudley Clark, head of a secretive unit known simply as A-Force, who sketched out the broad shape of what would become Operation Bertram before being called away to Washington to work on the cover plan for the Allied landings in North Africa. The detailed work of turning his outline into a workable plan fell to Lieutenant Colonel Charles Richardson of 8th Army's operations staff, a man who, by his own later admission, had never planned a deception of any kind before and had received no training in how to do so. The physical construction of the illusion, however, belonged to a different kind of unit entirely, the Middle East Command Camouflage Directorate, led by a former film art director named Jeffrey Barkas, whose ranks were filled with painters, theatrical designers, and at least one professional stage magician, Jasper Maskelyne, who had already made a name for himself disguising tanks as ordinary civilian lorries and, more ambitiously still, building a convincing decoy of Alexandria's entire harbor several miles from the real one. The plan that emerged rested on a deceptively simple idea: hide what is real by making it look ordinary, and make what is false look exactly as important and as exposed as the truth would have looked. Barkas's directorate had already proven the basic technique earlier in the Desert War when officers of the so-called Magic Gang built a folding canvas and timber frame, christened the Sun Shield, that could be lowered over a tank's turret and hull to recreate the silhouette of an ordinary 3-ton lorry. A single sun shield weighed little more than a heavy wardrobe and could be fitted or removed by a trained crew in a matter of minutes. Yet, from an aircraft cruising at altitude, it was, by the testimony of British pilots who tested it themselves, almost impossible to distinguish from genuine transport. One reconnaissance pilot flying directly over a column of disguised tanks during an earlier trial radioed back that he could not spot a single one, and that the deception was, in his words, excellent. For Bertram, around 360 individual tanks belonging to X Corps were given this treatment, a technique the planners referred to internally as cannibal. Each disguised vehicle sat for weeks looking exactly like the supply lorries parked around it, ground into the same dust, photographed from the air dozens of times without ever drawing suspicion. On the night before the attack, every sunshield in the forward area was lifted clear and the frames carried away, leaving the genuine armor ready to move within the hour, precisely as the barrage opened. Meanwhile, in the southern sector, an entirely separate and far larger illusion was being constructed from materials that had nothing to do with armor at all. Hundreds of dummy vehicles were built from stacked 4-gallon petrol tins arranged to suggest an engine block, food crates shaped and draped with netting to mimic a driver's cab, and old packing cases lashed together to form a convincing truck body, the whole arrangement finished with real tire tracks dragged across the sand to suggest weeks of genuine traffic. A camouflage officer who toured one of these dummy depots later described watching what he called dummy men, grubbing in dummy swill troughs, while a dummy engine puffed dummy smoke into the eyes of any watching reconnaissance aircraft. An illusion of ordinary Army routine convincing enough that German intelligence never once flagged the Southern buildup as anything other than genuine. Perhaps the most elegant single piece of the deception was what came to be called the dummy pipeline, a fake water conduit built from old 4-gallon petrol cans laid end to end, snaking southward at a steady, carefully measured rate of roughly 8 kilometers a day, exactly the pace a genuine pipeline-laying unit would need to sustain an army preparing to fight in the south. German reconnaissance could watch the pipeline grow, day by day, and draw the obvious and entirely false conclusion: no water meant no attack yet, and a pipeline heading south meant an attack from the south. When the real assault began in the north on the night of October 23rd, the dummy pipeline still had several days' construction left to complete, a detail Rommel's staff would later cite as one reason they believed the genuine offensive was still weeks away. The deception's most audacious touch, however, involved Munisib Depression in the southern sector, where 3 dummy artillery batteries were built and camouflaged with exactly the same care a real battery would receive. Over several days, that camouflage was deliberately allowed to degrade, a few netting strands left visibly loose, a gun barrel left slightly exposed, until German aerial photography would naturally conclude that the position had been spotted and abandoned as a decoy. Having taught the enemy to dismiss Munisib as worthless, the British then quietly replaced the dummy guns with real ones on the night before the battle. When a column of German armor later probed what its commanders believed to be a harmless, empty position, it walked directly into live artillery fire. What can be said with confidence about the operational results sits on firmer ground than most wartime claims of this kind, because the evidence comes substantially from the enemy's own mouths rather than British self-congratulation. When the Second Battle of El Alamein began on the night of October 23, 1942, nearly 1,000 British guns opened fire along the line at 9:40 in the evening, and infantry began moving forward through the German minefields known to the defenders as the Devil's Gardens, while engineers and sappers worked to clear and mark narrow lanes for the tanks of X-Corps to follow. Rommel himself was not even in the theater when the attack began, having returned to Germany on medical leave in September, leaving his deputy, General Georg Stumme, in temporary command. Stumme, according to the testimony later given by his own staff, believed the British offensive was still several weeks away, and went forward that night on a routine reconnaissance rather than placing his forces on full alert. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The clearest single piece of evidence for the deception's success came after the battle, when General Wilhelm Ritter von Thoma, commander of the Afrika Corps, was captured and brought before Montgomery personally. Von Thoma told Montgomery plainly that German intelligence had believed the 8th Army possessed at least one more armored division than it actually did, and that the main attack, when it came, would fall in the south rather than along the coast road in the north. Captured documents and prisoner interrogations from across the Axis line confirmed the same picture. The decoy buildup in the south had been accepted as genuine, and the true direction and timing of the assault had not been anticipated. For an army facing a numerically superior and supremely confident opponent on ground with almost no natural concealment, achieving that level of false confidence in the enemy's own command was a result few staff officers would have thought possible 6 weeks earlier. It is worth setting this beside what the Germans and Italians themselves were attempting at the same moment, because deception in the desert ran in both directions, even if with very different resources behind it. Rommel had laid extraordinarily dense minefields in places 5 miles deep to compensate for his chronic shortage of fuel, men, and replacement tanks, and Axis engineers used their own modest tricks to protect them, in one case dragging a vehicle axle and a set of tires on a long rope across open ground to create fake tire tracks, intended to lure Allied vehicles into believing a safe route existed where none did. It was a clever, low-cost piece of battlefield deception, but it operated at the scale of a single field, not an army. The American deception effort that would eventually rival Britain's, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, popularly remembered as the Ghost Army, would not be formed for another year, and when it was, its members, many of them artists and set designers in civilian life, were drawing directly on lessons the British camouflage units had already learned in the sand outside El Alamein. The comparison that matters most, though, is not between rival deceptions, but between what existing camouflage doctrine offered before Bertram and what Bertram actually achieved. Standard practice before 1942 treated camouflage as something units did to themselves, patchily and on local initiative, mostly aimed at avoiding individual losses to air attack rather than shaping an enemy general's entire understanding of a coming battle. Operation Bertram, by contrast, was conceived from the outset as a single coordinated plan, controlling an entire corps' worth of visual evidence, run by a dedicated directorate with the authority to dictate how thousands of men camouflaged, moved, and revealed themselves. It would not be the last time the trick was used. Versions of the same logic, hiding the real by making it dull and making the false look exactly as significant as the truth, would reappear in the much larger deceptions built around the Normandy landings less than 2 years later, where the methods pioneered in the Egyptian desert were scaled up to mislead an entire German army group about where an invasion fleet was actually heading. Assessing the precise weight of Bertram's contribution to victory at El Alamein requires some honesty about what can and cannot be known. Montgomery's Eighth Army held a substantial material advantage over the Axis forces in tanks, artillery, and supply by October 1942, and it would be wrong to suggest deception alone won a battle that was also decided by raw industrial weight and hard fighting through minefields that cost real lives. What the deception did achieve, and what the captured testimony of von Thoma and Stuma's own staff confirms, was to deny Rommel's forces the one advantage that might have offset that material gap: foreknowledge. An enemy braced for an attack in the right place, on the right date, can concentrate his reserves and blunt the first blow. An enemy convinced the attack is still weeks away and aimed somewhere else entirely cannot. The psychological effect on Axis command, the misallocation of armored reserves toward the south, and the lost hours before Rommel himself could return to the front and take stock, were the direct and measurable products of plywood tanks and a slowly growing fake pipeline. The physical traces of the deception itself have mostly returned to dust, as they were always designed to. The sunshields and dummy guns were canvas and timber, built to be assembled and struck within hours, and almost none survive intact. What does survive, in the archives of the Royal Engineers Museum and the Imperial War Museum, are the orders, the photographs taken by Geoffrey Barkas's own camouflage officers to check whether their dummies would pass aerial scrutiny, and the after-action reports in which German prisoners described in their own words exactly what they had been led to believe. A handful of surviving sunshield frames and reconstructed dummy vehicles are occasionally displayed in museum collections in Britain, alongside the more famous inflatable decoys built later for the Normandy deception, though most visitors who encounter them are surprised by how crude the individual pieces look up close, and how completely that crudeness vanished once it was viewed from the angle and the altitude it had always been designed for. Winston Churchill, announcing the victory to the House of Commons on November 11, 1942, singled out the camouflage operation by name, telling members that a complete tactical surprise had been achieved in the desert by what he called a marvelous system of camouflage, and that an entire armored corps had vanished overnight, leaving behind, in his words, an exact simulacrum of itself. Return for a moment to that German reconnaissance officer in his forward post, glasses trained on a horizon full of tanks that were never tanks at all. He did his job competently. He saw what was there to be seen, reported it faithfully up the chain of command, and was believed by men whose careers depended on reading the desert correctly. The failure was never his. It belonged to a system of assumptions, patiently constructed over 6 weeks by painters, stage designers, and amateur deception planners who had never run an operation like this before, who built an army out of packing cases and old petrol tins because the real one needed somewhere to hide and the desert offered nowhere to hide it. They could not make 1,000 tanks invisible, so instead they made 1,000 tanks boring, indistinguishable from the lorries rolling past them every day, and they made 360 pieces of plywood look like exactly the threat the enemy expected to find. By the time General von Thoma sat across from Montgomery as a prisoner and admitted what his intelligence staff had believed, the trick had already done its work and could afford to be revealed. The Eighth Army did not win at El Alamein because the Germans were foolish. It won in significant part because for 6 critical weeks the German army was looking at exactly what the British wanted it to see.